Hello, everyone. Thank you for checking out this special episode of Really Dicey. Today, we're going to talk about Islamic science fiction, a concept that you may not be very familiar with. Um, I'm here with Professor Muhammad Ahmad. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
Um,
you for having me.
I feel as game masters and even as human beings, the more experience we have with stories from other places and other cultures, not only do we become better people, we become better game masters and storytellers. So I brought Professor Ahmad here to talk about Islamic science fiction because science fiction to us maybe seem like a very new thing, especially in novels and movies, but science fiction, at least in the Islamic world, has been going on for maybe over hundreds of years. Am I correct about that?
Yes. So that's correct. I'll add a few disclaimers. So the first one is that, so first, just the term Islamic. So the term Islam refers to not just a religion, but it also refers to a culture. It also refers to a civilization. So there's an overlap between these categories, but they're not the same. And when we say Islam, the cultural output of the Islamic world, it historically speaking, and even now, it also includes a large number of people who are actually not Muslims. So especially in the medieval era, when we talk about, let's say, the golden age of Islamic world, a lot of uh, scientists and philosophers, they were actually Christians, but they still fall under the umbrella of the Islamic civilization. And so when we talk about science fiction within the Islamic context, then we can start with elements of what we now recognize as proto science fiction. So, for example, as you mentioned, the Arabian Nights or the 1001 Nights. Uh, so there are different stories in that collection which have elements like robots, flying mechanical machines, mechanical horses, travel to other planets, even time travel. So not science fiction in the in the modern sense of the term, but there are stories with elements which we can recognize as science fiction. Um, and beyond that, there's actually a novel from the 14th century in Arabic, which is recognized by some academics as perhaps one of the first science fiction novels, because it tries it's set in a fictional setting, but it tries to explain the natural the let's say the universe in a very naturalistic perspective, but in a fictional setting with some elements which we may recognize as science fiction. And then beyond that, when we talk about, let's say, the rise of science fiction as a modern genre, and which I would argue that it's definitely a Western construct, but at the same time, we do have examples of recognizably modern science fiction from Egypt from the 1860s onwards. So there's a long history of um, let's say science fiction, or at least proto science fiction, coming from what we now call the Islamic world.
Okay. It For anyone that may not be too familiar, how would you? Is there a difference between was it like Western science fiction from Islamic science fiction? Are there much major differences between the two?
Yes. So first, another disclaimer on terminology. So instead of Islamic, so the term that I prefer is Islamicate. So it's an academic term which refers to the cultural output of the Islamic world. So that's where just so that the distinction between, let's say, just something which is purely religious versus something which may be religious, something which may be cultural, so on and so forth. So in terms of differences, so the Islamic world encompasses vast number of cultures. So let's say if we compare the culture of Morocco versus, let's say, Mali versus Iran versus Malaysia, so they are vastly different, but at the same time, there's a commonality between them. So that's also reflected in the kind of sci-fi which comes out from these. So in terms of the themes where we see which are represented um, in the sci-fi, which is coming from these different parts of the world, then I would say there's a convergence of themes with the West. That said, the different concerns which are raised in these sci-fi, um, let's say novels and short stories, those are somewhat different. So just to give you an example, um, so in the early 20th century, we see especially a few examples from West Africa, sci-fi which with anti-colonial themes, for example. Versus if you look at more contemporary sci-fi coming from the Arab world, it's and just like Western sci-fi, it has taken a bleak dystopian overtone, especially after the failures of the Arab Spring. Versus again, if you go back to the early 20th century, then if you let's say look at Turkey, then we have let's say sci-fi or sci-fi utopias, which are very secular in nature, and that reflects the mood of the time, which transitioned from the Ottoman Empire to a secular republic, versus, let's say, if you look at the 60s and 70s, so we do see a noticeable change from, let's say, utopian construction of sci-fi utopias with a more religious bent. So another example is we have sci-fi utopias which are actually written by um, members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So there's a reflection of, as with all sci-fi globally, it's a reflection. So the future is a reflection of contemporary politics and concerns that people have.
Okay. So, how does one start a journey into um, learning more about it? Like, what books would you recommend people reading if they want to learn more about this?
So there are a few representational and foundational texts that I can recommend. And then beyond that, there's also the website that I've been running since my undergraduate days, since 2005. So it's islamsci-fi.com. So it has a compendium of stories, novels, even theater pieces, movies, which have come out from the Islamic world. And not just that, but even Western sci-fi, which have been inspired by Islamic cultures. So in terms of some recommendations that I give at the top of my head, since starting from a historical perspective. So, in fact, one of the first, literally the first feminist sci-fi utopia was written by Muslim women in British India in 1906. So it's a short story. It's in public domain. It's called Sultana's Dream. So it imagines this alternative world where the world is run by women, and because of that, it's a much better place. Uh, and more contemporary sci-fi. Um, so I talked about dystopian novels. So there's Ahmad Tawfiq's Utopia, which is actually a dystopia set in near future Egypt. Uh, Another really interesting work is Ahmad Sadawi's Frankenstein in Baghdad. So it reimagines the story of Frankenstein, but in a setting where, in the setting of post U.S. invasion Iraq. So it's a uh, commentary on the invasion, but as well as the internal problems of Iraq in terms of sectarianism, in terms of regionalism. So there are a couple that I would like to mention. So one is Aleph the Unseen by G. Willow Wilson. So she has worked on a number of well-renowned projects, including Spider-Man. And then beyond that, there is this book that came out just last month. It's called Islam, Science Fiction, and Extraterrestrial Life. So even beyond science fiction, it gives an overview of how extraterrestrial life has been imagined by, let's say, Muslim writers, Muslim scientists, within science fiction and outside of science fiction, and also a historical overview of speculation on this topic in the last 1400 years. Uh, Another somewhat dystopian novel, which also came from Egypt. It's called The Queue. It has a very Kafkaesque feel to it. Again, set in an unnamed Middle Eastern country after it's in an aftermath of failed revolution. So again, another allusion to the failure of the Arab Spring. Beyond that, in so beyond that, uh, so Yeah, I have also edited a couple of anthologies on this subject. So the one came out in 2008, so it's called The Mosque Amongst the Stars. And then there's another one which came out 3 years ago. It's called Islamicates. So both of these, you can buy them on Amazon, but at the same time, we have also released them publicly. So they're also downloadable from the website that I mentioned. And then beyond that, uh, as I mentioned, there are a number of resources which are available on the website.
What are some of your favorite stories, if I may ask, and why?
So actually, in fact, the my favorite story is actually from the anthology that I mentioned, Islamicates. So the anthology was actually part of a competition that we ran, um, and yeah, as I mentioned earlier, that the that Islamicate sci-fi, so it refers to the cultural output or sci-fi which is inspired from, let's say, Islamic theology or Islamic cultures. Uh, so because of that, the people who are contributing it, they need not be Muslims. So the person who won that anthology, he's actually he comes from a Jewish background, just to give you an example. And so the really interesting thing about that particular story, and without giving too many spoilers, um, is that so it's set in the 10th century Baghdad, and it centers around the story of Al-Khwarizmi, who is also credited with the invention of algebra. And in fact, the term algebra actually comes from a title of one of his books, and also the word algorithm also comes from his name. So it weaves his story, but with some mathematical functions, but with some, let's say, Islamic geometric patterns. So it's a very, I would say, beautiful mix of uh, mixing fiction with history, with, um, let's say, mathematics and just geometrical beauty.
Do you feel do you feel there's a lot of misconceptions about whether it be Islamic science fiction or even fantasy, that you feel that we misunderstand here?
So I'll address that from a historical perspective. Um, so if you look at, let's say, a lot of works, academic works have been written on representation of, let's say, Muslims in popular culture in general. And then also I've also researched on representations of Muslims in sci-fi over the last 100 years or so. Um, so one thing, so definitely there are misconceptions, misrepresentations, and that's part of, let's say, misrepresentation of Eastern cultures and not just Muslims in general. Um, I shouldn't say not just Eastern, but non-Western cultures in general. Um, with that said, over the last 2 decades or so, it has improved uh, and continues. Representation continues to improve. So that's definitely a good sign. That said, there are few things which you still see that people are hesitant. So, like the Dune series is coming out pretty soon. It's considered to be, some people consider it to be the greatest sci-fi novel ever written. Uh, so the thing is that the Middle Eastern elements, based on what I've heard about how it's being imaged, so there's a de-emphasis on some of the Middle Eastern elements. So, for example, the central character Paul Atreides. So his life is inspired by the lives of Middle Eastern prophets. So people like, say, Moses, Muhammad, Joseph. So it seems to be an amalgam of the life stories of many of these Middle Eastern prophets. And then beyond that, Middle Eastern culture is de-emphasized, and so there's an event in the novels which is basically a war against the machines, historically alluded. And so it's in the original, it's called, the term which is used for that war is jihad. But in the imaging in the TV series, it's now changed to crusade, and that's mainly because the negative connotations which are associated with this word. But historically speaking, and even now, um, even if you have little knowledgeable with Islamic theology, then it's not just, let's say, a holy war, but it has multiple connotations. Even things like daily struggles that a person faces. So there's this hesitancy, um, and also misrepresentation. So like in the 60s when Philip K. Dick, when he wanted to, let's say, critique certain branches of fundamentalist Protestantism, so he actually used, for one of his novels, a very stereotypical Middle Eastern fundamentalist setting. So there's some of that, but things are improving, I would say.
Okay. Again, thank you so much, Professor, for taking the time to talk to us about this. I feel very confident of knowing where to go and where to read. And speaking of where to go to read, can you share us again the website where people can go to um, find out more about Islamic science fiction?
Yeah, most certainly. It's islamsci-fi.com.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you very much. And for our viewers out there, please be safe and have a good day. Take care.